Before crowns were symbols of honor, they were instruments of fear. A king did not rule because he was loved. He ruled because people believed disobedience meant death, by law, by blade, or by God. Welcome to King's Hidden Horrors. If you're fascinated by the dark truth behind power, forgotten executions, and the lies that built empires, subscribe now. As you listen, ask yourself, if belief creates authority, who truly holds the crown? Leave a comment with the ruler, dynasty, or dark historical truth you want me to uncover next. Like the video if history should never be sanitized, and subscribe because some truths were buried for a reason. Long before kingdoms had borders, before laws were written in ink, power existed only in two forms: strength and belief. In frozen valleys and sunlit plains, early human communities followed the strongest hunter, the wisest elder, or the most feared warrior. Leadership was temporary. Authority could be challenged. Power had no symbol until someone realized that belief could outlast strength. The first crowns were not made of gold. They were made of bone, antler, carved wood, feathers stained with blood. They were worn during rituals, not celebrations. When the leader spoke wearing the crown, his words no longer sounded human. They echoed with something older, ancestral, divine, inevitable. This was the first deception.
The crown told the people, "I am not like you." And once that lie took root, violence became sacred. Divine permission to kill. To disobey a crowned figure was no longer disagreement, it was sacrilege. The king did not punish, the gods did. Executions were no longer hidden, they were public, ceremonial, theatrical. Snow-covered grounds became stages. Sunlight glinted off blades as priests declared judgment not in the king's name, but in heaven's. This transformed fear into obedience. A starving farmer might hate his ruler, but he feared the gods more. The invention of treason. Before crowns, rebellion was survival. After crowns, rebellion was treason. A word invented to justify extermination. Families vanished. Villages were erased.
Not because they rebelled, but because someone claimed they might. The crown did not need armies everywhere. It only needed belief everywhere. And belief spreads faster than soldiers. The crown as theater. Coronations were designed not to unify, but to intimidate. Bright sunlight, snow untouched except for a single path, silence broken only by chanting. The future king kneeling before relics soaked in the blood of ancestors. When the crown touched his head, the crown did not cheer. They knelt, because standing meant defiance. Ending Part 1. Cliffhanger. By the time gold crowns appeared, the weapon was already perfected. The crown no longer needed proof. It was proof. And soon, kings would discover something terrifying. If belief creates power, then fear can make it absolute.
When the crown learned to rule without being seen. Power discovered a terrifying truth. It did not need to be present to be obeyed. Once belief hardened into tradition, the crown no longer relied on constant violence. Fear became self-sustaining. The king could be absent, sleeping behind stone walls, while his authority walked freely through villages, courts, and households. The crown had evolved. It was no longer a weapon held in the hand. It had become a system. From blade to bureaucracy. Executions grew less frequent, not because mercy had emerged,
but because obedience had become instinct. The crown invented layers: scribes, judges, tax collectors, priests, messengers.
Each carried a fragment of royal authority, each wearing symbols smaller than the crown, but equally terrifying. A seal pressed into wax could destroy a family as effectively as a sword. The people learned to fear paper. Law as a sacred trap. Laws were no longer agreements, they were declarations. They were written as if discovered, not created, etched into stone tablets and read aloud as divine truths. To question a law was to question the ancestors. To question the ancestors was to invite extinction. The crown hid behind permanence. A king could die. The law could not. The illusion of order. Snow-covered roads stretched between towns, guarded not by soldiers, but by expectation. Everyone knew the rules. Everyone enforced them on each other. Neighbors reported neighbors.
Children repeated slogans. Priests preached obedience disguised as morality. The crown had turned the people into its armor. Ritualized loyalty. Ceremonies multiplied. Oaths were demanded at harvests, weddings, births. Even the dead were buried under royal blessing, ensuring loyalty beyond life. The crown inserted itself into every milestone until existence itself felt borrowed from authority. To live was to consent. Punishment without blood. Punishments changed shape. Exile replaced execution. Confiscation replaced torture. Silence replaced spectacle. A family stripped of land vanished slowly, starving quietly, freezing unnoticed. Fear learned to whisper instead of scream. This was more efficient. The crown and the calendar. Time itself bent to power.
Years were named after kings. Festivals celebrated coronations, not seasons. History was rewritten backward to suggest the crown had always existed. Memory was weaponized. If the crown had always ruled, then rebellion had never been justified. Faith reforged. Priests no longer merely blessed kings, they explained them. Failures became tests. Cruelty became necessity. Famine became punishment for insufficient obedience. The crown never starved. The people learned to blame themselves. The first silent rebellions. But belief is not invincible. In snowbound monasteries, scribes altered records subtly. In oral traditions, storytellers hid warnings inside myths. In households, parents taught children silence, not loyalty. The crown sensed something shifting.
And it responded the only way it knew how, by sharpening fear once more.
Fear does not vanish suddenly. It erodes. It cracks quietly, like ice under unseen pressure, until one day the weight that once held everything together becomes the force that shatters it. The crown never heard the sound. The first cracks. The crown believed obedience was permanent. It mistook silence for loyalty. But silence had changed. It was no longer submission. It was waiting. Villages still bowed. Priests still preached. Laws were still obeyed. Yet beneath the surface, belief had thinned. People followed rules not because they were sacred, but because they were predictable. And predictability can be studied. Fear had taught the people the system. Now the system taught the people where it was weakest.
When the crown became heavy. Generations passed and crowns grew heavier. Gold replaced bone. Jewels replaced feathers. Thrones became monuments. But weight is not only physical, it is symbolic. The crown demanded more ceremonies, more loyalty, more proof of obedience. Each demand revealed desperation. A ruler confident in belief does not ask to be worshipped. A ruler who doubts insists upon it. The weapon turns inward.
To preserve belief, kings intensified punishment. Executions returned, not as necessity, but as reminder. Snow once again stained red in public squares, but the crowds did not kneel as deeply. They watched, not with fear, but with calculation. They counted guards. They studied routines. They noticed hesitation. Fear, once absolute, had become performative.
The failure of divine right. The gods grew silent. Famine came despite prayers. Plagues ignored rituals. Wars were lost even after blessings. Priests struggled to explain contradictions. The crown blamed the people. The people blamed the crown. For the first time, authority fractured publicly. And once divine protection was questioned, the crown was no longer untouchable. Memory reclaimed. Hidden stories surfaced. Old songs resurfaced in taverns. Altered records were copied and shared. Children learned truths their grandparents had buried. The crown had weaponized memory, but memory, once freed, became a blade pointed upward. People remembered a time before crowns, and they realized something terrifying. If authority was invented, it could be undone.
The moment of refusal. Revolutions do not begin with violence. They begin with refusal. A village that does not kneel, a tax unpaid, a soldier who hesitates. The crown sent orders. They were ignored. Not shouted down, not protested, simply left unanswered. Fear had lost its voice. The fall is never grand. Crowns rarely fall in glory. They slip. A ruler flees under night snowfall. A palace burns without witnesses. A crown is hidden, not destroyed, because belief still lingers. The people do not cheer. They breathe. What replaces the crown? Something always fills the vacuum. Sometimes freedom, sometimes another crown with a different name. The lesson is never permanent, because the true horror was never the crown itself. It was the belief that allowed it to exist.
Epilogue. The weapon still exists. Crowns still shine. Not always on heads. Sometimes on flags. Sometimes on ideas. Sometimes on laws that cannot be questioned. The shape changes. The weapon remains. And every generation must decide. Will we kneel because we believe, or because we are afraid?